All right. Hey, Western Civ 2. So we're going to be continuing our uh, discussion on modern European thought. This is part 2, and particularly we're going to talk about Friedrich Nietzsche, or Friedrich Nietzsche, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Very popular uh, philosopher of the 1800s. And we're going to kind of look at his declaration that God is dead and what that naturally does to various aspects of worldview and how we perceive reality and life itself. So we discussed previously positivism, which in essence is everything should be able to be proven by logic/mathematics or science, and if it is not, it should not be deemed as reasonable to believe. We discussed some of the downfalls of that, and then we went into Charles Darwin and natural selection and how that kind of made his view of evolution very popular during his day, and obviously it's extremely popular during our day, to the point where most educational institutions teach macroevolution as if it's been proven scientifically, which it hasn't as of yet. So we looked at that, and then we looked at what happens when they start taking Darwin and applying him to society in what's called social Darwinism. So today we're going to look at some other things, some of the skepticism that's going to come out of this time period, and then ultimately it's going to culminate with Friedrich Nietzsche himself. So let's look at some things. So it's going to affect, skepticism is going to touch basically every aspect, but some of the main ones would be history, science, and morality. And so we're going to look at this, just a few examples of each. So David Friedrich Strauss published a book called The Life of Jesus, in which he questioned whether the Bible provided any genuine historical evidence about Jesus, contending that the story itself was a myth. Now, this becomes extremely popular in the the early 1900s, the quest for the historical Jesus, where basically all supernaturalism is written out of the Bible, and Jesus is kind of made to be just a normal person. And within that, all the miracles are erased, and then you just got a teacher at some level. Now, if you erase all the miracles, do you really even have a Jesus at all in the Bible? Now, this guy doesn't do that. Instead, he just basically says that the Bible doesn't provide any genuine historical evidence about Jesus. Now, what's interesting about this is, why the Bible? When you say the word Bible, it makes it sound like all these books are just one book. But the New Testament is 27 different works that all are historical works that have to be analyzed historically. And they all give accounts of Jesus, and particularly Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which also, when you study them from a historical perspective, you get this idea that there's other sources as well that they're appealing to that you predate them. For instance, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4 is one of the earliest references, because it's not Pauline, it's not from Paul, because all the verbs used in it aren't used anywhere else in Paul. So Paul is actually quoting a confessional creed that came before him, and it's about the death and resurrection of Jesus. So to say that the Bible provides no genuine historical evidence about Jesus is ridiculous. It would be like saying you found a biography written about Donald Trump, 1,000 years ago, or 1,000 years in the future, you find a biography written about Donald Trump, and it's dated around the same time as Donald Trump, and then you're saying there's no historical evidence for Donald Trump. You can say that, but what's your appeal? There's no historical evidence that contradicts what we actually do have. So anyways, Strauss is going to try to, say that Jesus was a historical person. Interesting. Nobody today says that. They'll take the miracles out of the Bible, but they won't say that Jesus was a historical person. Science. So a couple things here. The geology of Charles Lyell suggested that the earth was much older than the Bible contended. Well, a quick rebut here. Please show me in the Bible where it contends a certain age of the earth. Now, I can show you interpretations of the Bible that contend a certain age of the earth, but we talked about this in Western Civ 1 at the very beginning when we went over the different theories that fall under the old earth or young earth categories. And all those old earth theories that we discuss are proposed by Christians who have no problem saying the earth is old. Genesis does not date the earth. Now, traditionally, the Bible has been read as if Genesis happened, 6 to 10,000 years ago. So the Bible has traditionally been read through the lens of young earth. But geology cannot contradict what the Bible says because the Bible doesn't give a date to the earth whatsoever. And then we could also, start contending over the so-called evidence that makes the earth much older. We could talk about that as well. So even if you don't, accept that, or let's say even if you do accept the earth is millions upon millions and millions of years old, that doesn't necessarily contradict anything in the Bible. I could give one quick example of how the earth could be older, but actually be young. For instance, when Adam and Eve were created, if they were just created and then they were already there, right? They're adults. How old were they? Well, time-wise, they were, 0.5 seconds old or whatever, but they appeared to be extremely, way older than they actually were. So could the earth appear to be older than it actually is? That's a possibility. Now, I'm not saying that that's my theory. I'm just showing you how, logically speaking, the dating of the earth does not disprove the Bible whatsoever, because the Bible doesn't date the earth. Charles Darwin, we discussed him in length, but his theory is obviously going to cast doubt on the doctrine of creation. And so, and then more of the positivism critique. Anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists are all going to say that religion and its sentiments are just a product of nature itself, that it was a mechanism that nature produced within us to essentially help us survive. Interesting. And now we all of a sudden don't need it. And so there's history and science, but if we move on, there's going to be some more. And this is all under morality. So what does this do to what we think good and evil is and how we act toward one another? The immoral stories of the Bible and the immorality of the character of the God of the Old Testament is kind of brought up. So things like classic one, right? God commanding Joshua to kill all the men, women, and children and destroy everything from Jericho. How do we rectify that and reconcile that to the Bible's proposition that the God of the Bible is good, right? So that would be bring up, or how can the New Testament God sacrifice his own son, right? Which that's written really badly up here now that I'm looking at it. But, the idea here is, how is sacrificing your own son seen as good and moral, right? It takes the center of Christianity, the idea that Jesus sacrifices himself on our behalf. Well, God doing that is like a father killing his own son to save other people. How is that moral? So things like that are brought up, right? To which, some of that stuff, we don't quite know the mind of God. And some of that stuff we do, because the Bible reveals some of the mind of God. So, why did God command Joshua to kill men, women, and children, right? Well, maybe I don't know, but maybe our view of humanity is a lot more charitable than humanity really is. So what I mean here is we always refer to people as like innocents. But at some fundamental level, you have to come to the conclusion, if you're going to believe what the Bible says and testifies about mankind, you're going to have to believe at some level that mankind is sinful and wicked. The Bible doesn't characterize them as neutral, some of them good, some of them bad. It characterizes them as fallen, broken, constant. I mean, even the best of them are making up some of the most messed up things. David and Bathsheba, and then killing her husband to hide that he got her pregnant. I mean, it's a soap opera. And David was a man after God's own heart, still tainted by sin. And the sin that he did was super destructive, right? Murder, adultery, things like that. Mankind isn't good. It's actually characterized as being evil and wicked and in rebellion, meaning an open war against God. Jesus actually tells the Pharisees that if they were the seed of Abraham, if they were the children of Abraham, they would accept Jesus because he comes from God, who is the God of Abraham. But since they don't, they're more like their actual father. And he basically tells them that they are children of Satan. And that really is anyone who is in rejection of Jesus is that's how the Bible describes them. They are subjected to the principalities and the prince of the air, right? Satan himself. And their desires are not for God, but against him rather. Now, the whole New Testament, God the Father sacrificing God the Son, how could a father do that? Well, first of all, you're getting the horse. You're doing the cart before the horse at that point, because we get our ideas of what a father and a son should be from God, because he's eternal. He was the eternal father, eternal son. So our concept of father and son should come from him, not his concept of father and son come from us. That's one thing to say there. But then another thing to say there is this is acting like Jesus didn't have a choice in the matter. But that's not the biblical representation here. The Trinity is working together on this, that all three of them are playing a unified part in our salvation and in the sacrifice of Christ. So Nietzsche is going to ramp it up a little bit. And, Nietzsche gets it right. He understands Christianity properly. He just rejects it outrightly. So I want to read a couple of, some of his things. He says that Christianity is a religion of sheep that glorify weakness rather than the strength life requires. That is almost verbatim, exact good description of Christianity, other than the fact that the strength life requires. We would argue, well, the life that he's talking about is actually death. That Jesus tells us that when we die to ourselves, then we will really find life. But his description ultimately of Christianity, of a religion of sheep who glorify weakness, is just about correct. We wear crosses because we glorify Christ in his ultimate weakness, brought death to death. Because even the weakness of God is stronger than the strength of man, and the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of man. Nietzsche also says, war and courage have accomplished more great things than love of neighbor. So you can kind of see what he's about, right? He's looking at the world, quote unquote, realistically, and he's saying, the strong survive, and the strong shape the world, not the love of neighbor, so to speak. So let's move and let's look at Nietzsche a little more in depth in a second. So this is just a quick side note, right? During this time also, you have some conflict between church and state, particularly in education. And this is really where you're going to start getting a separation of education from the quote-unquote church. Now, all throughout the Enlightenment, one of the arguments is that the church should not be carrying out the education. And you've had little examples of this, but now we're going to start seeing it become law, so to speak. So this idea of public school, right? It's starting to take shape in the 1800s, end of the 1800s. So let's look at Britain. The Education Act of 1870 provided for the construction of state-supported schools, that's public schools, run by elected school boards. So it's not run by the church. It's not run by the government, but technically it is because it's supported from the government, and it's elected school boards. So people are going to elect the quote-unquote school boards. This creates a rivalry between the Anglican Church and the state over education because the Anglican Church played a huge role in education. This act forced them to increase the costs of their own schools because if free education is being provided for over here, a lot of people are going to go to the free education. Thus, you have to increase the cost because you have less students in order to run, which is, again, why private schools, even today, are usually more expensive. Lake Point's kind of an exception to that. It's not overly expensive, but it's still more expensive than public school because public school's free. So they had to increase the cost. And then the Education Act of 1902 decided to provide state support for both religious and non-religious schools. So there's still an aspect here where the government is not just trying to get rid of religion for the sake of getting rid of religion. It's providing money for that. But it's a step in that direction. And then that kind of the next example of this would be France. They had a dual system, Catholic and public schools. Under the Falloux law of 1850, the local priests provided religious education in public schools. The later Ferry laws replaced religious instruction in public schools with civic training. So religion was in public schools, and the Ferry laws take it out. Members of religious orders could no longer teach in public schools because of the Ferry laws. In 1905, the Napoleonic Concordat with the Pope, so Napoleon, his Concordat with the Pope is terminated, and this completely separates church and state in France. And then the last example will be Germany. Bismarck is going to remove both Catholic and Protestant clergy from overseeing local education in Prussia, and he set education under the state through administrative orders in 1870, 1871, and then the quote-unquote May laws of 1873 required priests to be educated in German schools and universities. The state could veto the appointment of priests, and the Pope and the church could not discipline the priests. Only the state could. And so you can kind of see, once again, this constant interaction of state and church is starting to pull apart a little bit, and it's usually the state initiating it, trying to bring education under the state. And we could ask, well, has education been good since then? The argument would be, well, sometimes, most of the time not. All right, so Nietzsche, we'd mentioned him, right? The glorified sheep, religion of sheep guy. He really, in my mind, I'm not saying that this is 100% true, but I think it is. He represents the logical end or conclusion to where Darwinism and positivism, the idea that science is all-knowing and science is the way, only science, things that can be proven by science is reasonable. And then Darwin, like this idea that like we ultimately evolved, we weren't created, right? This really, he's going to show us where this naturally ends. And he's just going to go ahead and say it. Look, guys, God is dead. He's going to pronounce the death of God. And then he's just going to be honest about what that means. So when one removes God, one removes a foundation for morality, for reason itself, and human purpose. So think about it. If there is no God and everything can be proven by science, what exactly is your foundation for that statement that science is right or science is true? How exactly do you go about proving that? Well, Nietzsche is going to be pretty honest. He's going to use familiar language to us 21st century people, language of social construct, right? That kind of language is very much at home in Nietzsche because he's looking at Darwinism and evolution, macroevolution, as what it is. There is no God, and because of that, morality, reason, and human purpose, it's limited. So let's talk about each one of those things. first, what's dead God morality? So if God is dead, if there is no God, um, what is good and evil? So he writes 2 works here, Beyond Good and Evil and The Genealogy of Morals, 1887, 1886. And he sought to discover not what good and evil are, but rather the social and psychological sources of the judgment of good and evil. So look at this quote, there are no moral phenomena at all, but only a moral interpretation of phenomena. Meaning, there is no actual good and evil. That's just a way that we interpret things. So that our interpretation, what we would call good and evil, comes from our social background and psychological background. Since God doesn't exist, it can't come from him. Therefore, Nietzsche's looking for a different explanation. Well, he's going to say it's because of your social background and your psychological background. And he's going to take a step further, right? He's going to say this: we need a critique of moral values. The value of these values themselves must first be called in question. So first, we need to talk about moral values themselves. Are they even, should we even have a set of good things and a set of evil things? Do we actually need that? He's going to go on to say morality is a human convention. It's a social construct, right? It has no independent existence apart from humankind. It doesn't exist outside of humankind, but it only exists inside of humankind. Therefore, we have shaped it, right? So going back to our, all the way back to the Renaissance, right? Plato pointing up and saying, there's universals up in the heavens, the forms are in the heavens. He's saying good and evil exist outside of ourselves, that they have forms, something of objective reality outside of ourselves. Well, Nietzsche is going to go ahead and just pronounce, well, if we're going to take the Aristotle route, looking down at the stuff, pointing down and saying the particulars, well, then good and evil must exist within the particulars. Thus, we shape good and evil. We make good and evil. And so the idea here is to free man to create whatever values he or she wants, thus free mankind to better themselves, glorifying pride, assertiveness, and strength rather than meekness, humility, and weakness. All the things that Christianity glorifies. So in a summary statement, if God is dead, then the source of morality is ourselves. And we can change it if we want to, because we're the source. So what about reason? Dead God, reason. If God is dead, what about reason? The Birth of Tragedy in 1872, Nietzsche points out that many non-rational aspects of human nature were as important as the rational characteristics. So he's going to do, in a way, what the Romantics tried to do. He's going to try to take reason and bump it down a notch and say there are equally unreasonable things about man that are equal part of his nature. Right, and so in this case, an example would be like, okay, there's guns blazing, and you're going to charge those guns in order to save someone, right? That is unreasonable, but another word for that is courage. Someone might say stupidity, right? Because sometimes courage and stupidity are very closely related to each other. So that's kind of his point there. And he's going to take a lot of those non-reason things, like courage, and he's going to exalt them because those things are good. And the strength of the heroic life lay in sources beyond rationality. Now, another thing to mention here, though, is if you remove God, rationality, like morality, is sourced within ourselves. We are the ones that define what is reasonable and what is not reasonable. So it's very subjective. All right, let's go to his last one. Dead God, purpose. What about the purpose of mankind if God is dead? Thus spake Zarathustra, and you'll read some excerpts of this. He wrote this in 1883, announced the death of God and proclaimed the coming of the Overman, or the Superman, right? The Uberman in Ubermensch in German. The Superman, the coming of Superman. And this is like Achilles, Odysseus, heroic figures found in the epics of Homer. Some of the godlike figures found in the epics of Homer. These are humanity is, in his mind, in these epics, it's saying there's where we're going. And so it's writing about where one day we'll be. And so his whole thing about the purpose of mankind is to essentially evolve, to get better, to become those super heroes, so to speak. Maybe that's why we have an obsession with Marvel. So purpose is then reduced to heroic man, and it's temporal, right? Because you're going to die eventually. Human beings had to forge from their own inner will and determination the truth and values to exist in the world. So you can kind of see that that's why it's important to really think about the so-called science of Darwinism. Um, if macroevolution exists and it wasn't initiated by God, okay, so if we can accept those two things, macroevolution exists and it wasn't initiated by God, reason, morality, and purpose are all subjective and found within yourself, and thus temporal, and not necessarily right or wrong. Like, you can change it and who cares? It's found within yourself. So you get to ultimately be the God of your life until you die. Nietzsche, ironically, or maybe fittingly, goes absolutely insane by the end of his life. And by the end of his life, he's almost totally silent, insane person, and dies. Which it's hard not to then say, well, the philosophy that he put forward, the death of God, the proclamation that God is dead, is an absolutely insane statement to make. But when you're operating under Darwinism and positivism, and you're already biased against the fact that since I cannot prove God scientifically, mathematically, well, we can make some arguments maybe mathematically. There's some really good arguments for God mathematically and reasonable. But let's say you know scientifically can't prove him, and you logically and mathematically can't exactly prove him. Thus, you must reject him. And then Darwinism, if it's true, right, then it's looking less and less likely like we were created intentionally and with purpose to more like we just evolved and here we are. If you accept those two things, you know, God is dead, right? Those are utterly insane. If you look at it through the lens of there is a God and he did do what the Bible says he did. He created us. If you look at it through that lens and then you start analyzing Nietzsche, what's not insane about what he's saying, right? So interesting, we still feel the fragments and echoes of Friedrich Nietzsche. I want to go ahead and give you a couple quotes from him and also some quotes from another guy we feel the fragments of, Sigmund Freud. So let's look at this real quick. The Christian resolution to find the world ugly and bad has made the world ugly and bad. So he looks at the sinful and broken world, which is ugly and bad, and he blames it on the Christians. Because we have stated that the world is ugly and bad so much, and we've taught that over and over and over again, the world is ugly and bad. This kind of idea that we've created this reality. So you can see his philosophy at work there. If we can just get rid of this idea of ugly and bad, and we can start teaching different values, we can create the world in our image. So again, very much reality is found within humanity itself. If humanity can tell a different story, then a different story will come about. That's the idea there. There's not enough love and goodness in the world to permit giving any of it away to imaginary beings. And then he's just, he's playing around. If love and goodness is lacking in the world, so let's not give it to this invisible God. Again, absolutely insane if there is an invisible God who demands our love and goodness, right? Sigmund Freud, popular psychologist along the same lines, atheist and very much influenced by Darwin. The whole thing is so patently infantile, so foreign to reality that to anyone with a friendly attitude to humanity, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life. I'm talking about Christianity and Christians, right? And then the virtuous man contents himself with dreaming that which the wicked man does in actual life. Which, by the way, that might be true, but that's just further proof that everyone is wicked and bent that way. Some people are more courageous with their wickedness, and some people are cowardly with their wickedness. They just dream about what the wicked man does in actual life. But that's not saying anything that Christianity doesn't say. So anyways, the summary of this lesson is, if you kill God, the idea of God, you remove the foundation for what Plato would call the universals, things that exist outside of mankind that are just true no matter what we say about it. They are true outside of ourselves. There is good. It is a thing. And no matter how we do or what we say, we cannot change that thing. Well, if you kill God, universals they have to become particulars. You have to find your universals in the particulars. You have to find your objective reality in the things themselves. And that's what Nietzsche attempts to do. But what does that lead us to? It leads us to postmodernism, which is where we're at today, right? That we create the story that we walk in. And I'll leave you with that. So let's pray, and then we'll be done. Father, thank you for this day. Be with these students. Bless them. Show us how incredibly important it is to know that you are true and to follow you. That something as simple as making the statement that you created has profound implications for everything we do. Let us find comfort in the fact that you exist outside of ourselves, that we are not all that there is, and that there is something beyond us that is real and objectively true. Reveal yourself to us in Jesus Christ. We pray these things. Amen. All right, guys. I'll see you on the next time.